right, well, this is the Grass is Greener on WXRW 104.1 FM in Milwaukee. I am the host of the program, Gary Grass, and with me is my co-host, Babette Grudeau.
Hi, and tonight we have Ricardo Vaz. He's a Latin America correspondent, and he's editor of Venezuela Analysis. He's joining us tonight to give a news roundup on Latin America to begin the new year. Welcome, Ricardo Vaz.
Hi, Gary and Babette. It's great to be here. Always a lot to talk about from Latin America. I'd just like to stress from the off that, anything on Venezuela, I'll be speaking on a personal capacity, so it's not necessarily the position of Venezuela Analysis.
Sure.
But ready to jump in.
That's probably true about everything you'll say on every country.
Yeah, when it comes to my position as Latin American correspondent, I wear it proudly, and it's a position the grass is greener.
For identification purposes only, it's like, any views expressed on Israel or whatever are not those of Venezuela Analysis. Well, they might be, but that's up to them.
Yeah, they'll likely be, but getting.
So, Latin America has really had the spotlight stolen away over the last year. There's been some things that have been in the news, but all eyes went to Russia and Ukraine, then they all went to the Middle East, and very seldom do we get back to Latin America anymore, which was our bread and butter when we started this whole thing. But I've been hearing stuff about Ecuador, I've been hearing stuff about
Trump wanting to retake the Panama Canal and maybe a soft invasion of Mexico. It's some crazy stuff. He's also talking about taking over Greenland, so
Yeah, Greenland counts sort of as the Americas. I don't know.
Yeah,
we'll put it in your field there.
America's adjacent. I think we have jurisdiction over Greenland as well.
Yeah. Okay, so what do you think is the most important thing?
Let me start with kind of a general roundup to see more or less how we orient ourselves, and then I'll go into one particular topic.
Sure.
We'll handle those that Babette brought up now, and then perhaps towards the second half we'll talk about Venezuela, because things are happening. Things are always happening.
Yes. I've been seeing Venezuela news as well, not just Ecuador.
So, with Trump, he's not even taken office, and he's already opening all these fronts. But I think we'd be wise to remember that there's a lot of bluster involved, right? He always wants to make these grandiose statements.
It's mug.
Yeah, and sometimes it just reflects his own deluded vision of the world. But I think sometimes it's also to just generate a constant noise that kind of feeds his own persona and his own agenda. So I think, starting with the Panama Canal, which is maybe the most significant one of those, he says, we are getting ripped off at the Panama Canal, and they are charging too much, and we're going to take it back. And then, of course, even the Republican Party, which is no voice of wisdom really, has to come after him and say, that's not really what he meant. Maybe we can, even if we wanted to buy it back, it's not for sale and stuff like this. So perhaps he just strikes a very extremist and outlandish position so that he can later get to the negotiating table and then perhaps secure some slightly more favorable terms for U.S. corporations, if that's his ultimate goal in the Panama Canal. What we have to understand is that with Trump and particularly with his following, he doesn't necessarily need to accomplish anything. He just needs to sell it like he did, because there's a very low threshold on accepting him at his word. So I think that's built into the way that
Mexico still hasn't actually paid for that wall, as far as I know.
Yeah, who knows what happened to that wire payment? But that's the typical example, and perhaps with that we can jump to Mexico, right? He goes out and says, we're going to build a wall and Mexico is going to pay for it. And then in the end, both, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me, both Obama and Biden administrations built larger extensions of the wall than Trump. But it's an issue that's really more associated to Trump. So it goes to show how the public opinion and all the noise sometimes is not really correspondent with what's happening on the ground. And it just creates this constant controversy that he seems to feed off of.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. I mean, there is like a definitely the biggest difference is style, right? I mean, there are people out there who will say with a straight face that it simply doesn't matter who the president is because the president doesn't have anything to do with foreign policy, right? Which is like astonishing to like the people that think, oh, president is the person who does all the foreign policy. Congress has no role in it. Well, Congress doesn't have much role in it, but these people will say that, well, the foreign policy establishment does everything, right? They had everything to the president. The president just rubber stamps it. And of course, I think what the reality is sort of like that maybe 75% true, maybe 80% true. And then the president, does what he can to push things in his own particular direction, right? And so Trump, I mean, you had like a very, very aggressive, like towards Venezuela. They were the ones that wanted to like do like a hard coup. They were ones who wanted to like send troops and whereas Biden was just like, well, we'll interfere with the elections, and Obama was like, we'll interfere with the elections. We'll just declare this person the winner or whatever, right? It's I think the Democrats usually act smarter, right? But it's like there's always sort of these kind of competing poles, and there's always like a little bit of wiggle room between what happens.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great way to frame it. We can take foreign policy as being on some sort of autopilot, and then there's influence on what the administrations do because it's also their own agenda. I'm not sure I would call the Democrats as acting smarter, or perhaps even a bit more worried about appearances and how the discourse is framed in terms of the US being this quote unquote beacon of freedom and democracy and so on, whereas Trump is a lot less worried about how he looks, because he just says what he thinks he wants to be, and that's it. However, there's also a degree of unpredictability when it comes to Trump, and I think that's also why he faces a lot more resistance from the establishment. It's because sometimes it just goes in a completely wild direction. And for me, the biggest example was the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, in early, I can't remember, maybe 5 years ago or 4 years ago. Because, I mean, that was one of the options, but one that the military put there just, as something unrealistic, and then Trump went for that one. So there is, of course, I mean, it would be false to claim that there is no influence from the president, from the administration on foreign policy. But the overall interests are to a great extent predetermined, and so it's sometimes a matter of how hard they're pushed and how much care there is for the foreigners. But since we were on Mexico, there was this thing. I mean, he also threatened Canada with 25% tariffs, and they're going to pay for it, otherwise it's going to be even worse. And here, I think there are two aspects to it. One is that the trade relations with Mexico are to Mexico's disadvantage, right? I mean, this is U.S. companies taking advantage of cheap labor and free trade agreements. So it's not clear at all that imposing tariffs would benefit the U.S. economy, and even 25% is such an outlandish number that it would immediately have a lot of ripple effects. And the other aspect is that there are these free trade agreements in place, and these were originally NAFTA, and then when Trump was in office the last time around, and López Obrador was in Mexico, Trump also had this very hardline discourse. We're getting ripped off with NAFTA, and then they were renegotiated. But for all intents and purposes, it's still a free trade agreement in place. So even if he wanted, he can do some kind of symbolic measures, but I don't think he can just levy a flat 25% tariff on everything from Mexico. And the other part, I think, Mexico's new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has been very un-Trump-like in her reaction, so very measured and very calm and very realistic in saying, we don't expect a tariff war. We expect, good relations and so on, but also threatening, if Trump wants to go in that direction, we will respond in kind, and then we'll see who comes out the worst of it. And it's worth recalling that if Trump's priority, or another of his priorities, is migration, with all this racist discourse, then Mexico is a key ally for the U.S. in that regard, because it kind of displaced the U.S. southern border to Mexico's southern border as a kind of more distant barrier against these migrant caravans. So the US also needs Mexico's cooperation in that regard, unless it wants just to throw everything out the window. So that goes to show again that there's some distance between what Trump might
Mexico
think
stops.
he can do and what he can actually do. Sorry.
Mexico stops a lot of the Central Americans and others who are coming up, trying to get to the U.S. Stops them in Mexico, right?
Exactly. So Mexico has very strict controls in its border with Guatemala, and also, I mean, there's been a lot of fair criticism, I would say, about Mexico's policy towards migrants, but it was kind of the deal they felt they had to make with the US to avoid this constant tension at the border. So I believe that that's going to continue, even if it's a bit hardened. And so for all of Trump's bluster, he does need to work with Mexico. But then again, it's how he frames it for his supporters.
I mean, the tariff thing is just kind of amazing. I mean, we had James Galbraith on the show talking about the effects of tariffs on some of these places, and it's like, you know, you have to work out in pretty awesome detail exactly what they're going to do because there's all sorts of ripple effects. And in the case of Mexico, it's like, well, you know, and in the case of China, I mean, the Trump supporters, most of them have no idea what a tariff even is, right? I mean, you're taxing U.S. businesses for making use of the favorable trade environment that you've spent the last several decades trying to engineer for them, right? You know, we built this all for you, but if you want to use it, you're gonna have to pay. So it's like it's just a tax on U.S. businesses for doing what the government has set up exclusively for them to use, right?
Yeah, they have to pay for a policy that is designed to lower their costs.
Yes, yes. I mean, makes sense to make them pay, but I mean, it's the way this actually works out is it's like, well, you know, you can't just like charge something and just that means you get more money because you're charging more. I mean, it's like, no, there's actually economics. There's supply and demand. You know, you charge more, people will buy less. And it's like they'll get it somewhere else. And there's all sorts of different things that happen. But these people, they don't think about the first, 10 seconds of like basic economics or like even know what a tariff is. They just think it sounds good, and Trump must know because he's rich. But I mean, he's getting most of his wealth from like, having people donate to his legal defense funds. So it's like it's not a grift that can be applied to the national economy.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, in such a globalized context here that we have, in this day and age, and with the way that corporations are no longer really attached to a single country, and they can find all these schemes and loopholes to escape taxes and so on. And so imposing more bureaucracy and more hurdles, which is what tariffs actually amount to, is not going to have this immediate benefit, which it's not even the Trump administration's goal if it's in terms of creating jobs in the US and having some kind of strengthening of sovereign production. It's just going to solve itself through these mechanisms of global capitalism. But again, I think it's more of a rhetorical issue than something that's really going to put into practice.
Yeah, but I think it's a big bluff, but the fact that it is only a bluff is backed up by reality. Because if you ever did try to do it, it wouldn't last long because it wouldn't work well. So so all that ever really happens is like a little tiny piece of these things. Because if you do too much of what he says he wants to do, it'll just hurt too much to be doing it. And he doesn't want to destroy everything. So he'll do a little bit of it to like say that he's doing it, and the rest of it doesn't get done. So you see like these little
backfire eventually.
Yeah. That's it. So what we actually do get from Trump is, I think it's like you say, it's mostly just unpredictable, right? But it's continuation with little bits of random thrown in.
Yeah, and media controversy. But going back to Mexico, there's a different aspect which Babette mentioned when we were discussing doing this show, which might be a bit more serious, which is this idea that they're going to designate the cartels as terrorist organizations, and if that would open the door for, I mean, it is intervention in any literal sense, but kind of small covert operations to eliminate these leaders or what have you. There was an article on Rolling Stone on what this limited invasion could look like.
Yeah,
And
soft invasion.
Soft invasion. Yeah, I mean,
It'd be very ugly.
I'd like to meet whoever comes up with this terminology.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
yeah,
it could be not soft at all because if they're considered terrorists and the joint, special operations forces that we have to deal with terrorism, they do some awful stuff.
yeah, I think it would be very unprecedented to do it and a very significant step. It's not something that they can do and just, keep under wraps. And it would be known quite quickly. And so Mexico has been very adamant again that, they're not going to allow this to happen, that they are a sovereign country and they are the ones responsible for dealing with these problems, and that dealing with the drug cartels is not just a matter of putting a label and then expecting that to change anything. So, but here again, it goes to show on this unpredictable line that Gary was mentioning, that it might also be again a negotiating or a bluff to kind of force Mexico to say, we're going to spend more, we're going to be more active in fighting the drug trade, but at the same time, this conception that these are just bad guys who are flooding the U.S. with drugs is a complete fantasy, right? I mean, the drug trade exists because it's a very lucrative economic sector, right? And because there's demand for it, and there's a level of embedding that at some point crosses with the let's say the regular economy, because I mean this money has to be laundered somewhere, and so
it's here in the U.S.
Yeah, and it's always been the case.
The US.
I remember, I mean, this must have been 15 or 20 years ago. There was a scandal with Wachovia Bank because they were laundering hundreds of millions of dollars from the drug trade.
There was like specialized boxes where they could put in their drug money.
Yeah, they were depositing hundreds of millions in travelers' checks, and no regulator thought, this might be irregular. So, I mean, again, it goes to show how the issue is being distorted and tackled from the wrong place when the issue is really demand and the lucrative nature of it. Of course, Mexico is in the middle of it, sometimes just in terms of the route, but it depends on how it's distorted for propaganda purposes.
Yeah, I mean, if you remember the TV series Miami Vice, if I'm not mistaken, they like their grand finale for the series. Crockett and Tubbs, wound up in a room with some like banking executive who told them, "You're never going to stop any of this from coming in because we own it. It's ours. Everything could fall down, if we didn't have all this money coming in. What do you think is like wafting up this city and this state, this country? It's us, the big banks, taking all the cartel money. Get over it." I was like, "Oh, okay."
Well, that about sums it up. But yeah, when it comes to this issue, I mean, of course, he wants to sound like he's being tough on organized crime and so on. But this and also the other thing is how deep the U.S. agencies and the DEA in particular is also embedded in the drug trade, and how the CIA historically was embedded in the drug trade. Just a few days ago was another anniversary of the death/suicide of Gary Webb, who had exposed the crack cocaine and crack cocaine deal and the deals and the ties to Nicaraguan Contras. So I mean, if there was a real interest in addressing the drug trade, it would actually start in Langley and in DC and in Wall Street. But again, it's just more about perception and whether Trump can claim that he's being tough on crime. They might try some kind of joint operation with Mexican forces. But again, unpredictability is there. I would be surprised if they launch some kind of unilateral armed intervention in Mexico. But I mean, if they do, it will also not be the first time that something outlandish like that happens.
So that we've covered a bunch of big stories that we've decided really aren't as big as they sound. What is actually big?
I mean, let's first cover another story which might not be as big as it sounds.
Okay. Oh yeah, we'll finish up with this.
Let's finish with the stories that are not as big as they seem. So in Ecuador, there are going to be elections soon. Let me get the date. But there a few days ago on Twitter, So the elections are on February 9th. And on Twitter, there was a lot of discussion that a coup is underway in Ecuador, a coup is underway in Ecuador, and what's actually going on. And it seems that the issue at heart is that, Daniel Noboa, the president, is going to run for re-election. And so he's supposed to ask for a leave to, campaign, and his vice president remain in charge. But he has kind of signaled that he doesn't want to do it, and the armed forces are kind of backing him on that. And so, this led both the leftist opposition, associated to Correa, and also, I mean, he has had a feud with his vice president, believe it or not. And so there's a lot of back and forth whether this.
It seems like that always happens in Ecuador.
Yeah, somehow they choose the worst vice president. Lenin Moreno, who then betrayed the citizen revolution, was also a vice president. So maybe they should do stricter background checks. But it seems more of a legal technical issue, because of course, I mean, if he does stay on as president and in command of the armed forces, it might suggest that he wants to have more control and perhaps use that force to his advantage to try and improve his possibilities in the election. But I don't think it would mean that the election is suspended or that he would remain in place, he would remain in power beyond them. So it might also be that this controversy is already part of the campaign, right? It's already framing Noboa as someone who does not respect the rules and someone who wants to abuse his power. And actually, he has been strung by another scandal involving the armed forces and the assassination of minors recently. So it could tie into, let's say, a pre-electoral campaign against the sitting president there.
All right. Okay. So,
will that have an effect on how people perceive him, and maybe affect negatively how they would vote?
Yeah, I mean, the situation in Ecuador has become, I mean, it has been a mess ever since Correa decided he needed a sabbatical and left in 2017. So we had this successive, first Moreno, who kind of really turned against the project, and then there was this banker, what was his name? Someone who was in power and then was impeached, and then Noboa won the snap elections that were called after this impeachment. Or rather, he resigned to avoid the impeachment, but then Noboa was elected, and he had. We talked about this on the show, that he was only going to finish his predecessor's term, and so it was a very short, like 18-month period, and then they would have new elections. But the main issue in Ecuador in recent times has been insecurity and these prison riots. There was a candidate who was assassinated on the campaign trail and so on, and they instituted some kind of martial law, went into closer ties with U.S. institutions, military institutions, first and foremost. And so Noboa, his main angle is that he's going to be tough on crime and he's going to crack down on cartels that are spilling over from Colombia. And then of course he manages to tie everything to this fantasy that the left is behind everything. And of course Correa, with his very successful 10-year term, is still blamed for every problem in Ecuador. And on the other hand, Correa's own forces have not been able to react. I mean, it's with so much instability and economic troubles and so on, they haven't been able to get back to power. And they are sticking with the same candidate, Luisa Gonzalez, who is charismatic and has her own merits. So we'll see. I mean, it's the third time she's running for office. We'll see if third time's the charm for Salvador Allende. Just a random bit of history. It was on the third time they actually won the election. But the issue is how this kind of instability and insecurity might spill over to the elections. And then I think we might have discussed this at some point. The X factor in Ecuador is the indigenous movement. Mm-hmm. At some point was very belligerent and very active, and even drove Moreno. I mean, Moreno had to run away from the capital because there were these huge mobilizations. But then in the end, they couldn't really decide on a plan of action and just kind of retreated with some concessions, and they mobilized again, extracted some more concessions, which were more, not really concessions, but rather commitment that some policies were not going to change, like fuel subsidies and so on. but they've also, because of past history, they've clashed with Correísmo, with Correa's leftist forces.
Right.
And so even though they have very clearly a common enemy, it's never gotten to a point where these more organized indigenous sectors explicitly back the leftist candidate, and they haven't been able to reach some kind of minimal joint program going forward. And so I think that's going to play into the next elections again. I mean, at some point it looked like they were going to become some kind of significant political force, but then that kind of faded away because of their own inability to sort out what they were going to do. But they're still going to play kingmaker, if you want to call it like that, depending on whether they endorse the left or endorse no one at all.
Yeah, the indigenous and the left in Ecuador seem like they are kind of very imperfect natural allies, right?
Exactly.
They're much closer to each other than they are to what's outside of them, but it's very difficult for them. There's these natural fault lines that make it hard to get things together and be unified the way they would need to be to make sure that you don't have a Noboa in office.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there are two factors among certainly many others. One of them is Correa himself. I think he should shoulder some of the blame because because of the support that he had, he was very hostile in dealing with indigenous sectors, especially when it came to kind of environmental protections. He came off, he's a bit arrogant, and so he felt like he didn't really need to engage with them. And the other is that, these indigenous and to a similar extent, environmental movements are very vulnerable to NGOs, and NGOs in turn answer to their funders, which may come from agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy or USAID and so on, and that kind of muddies their agenda. So they might be tempted, and this happened after this strong protest, that they want to stay away from politics because it might compromise their funding, and so it's more complex in terms of, let's say, soft power influence from the US in this indigenous and environmental politics, which, even though, as you're saying, they are natural allies, they have also been kind of covert fronts to undermine the left, not just in Ecuador, in the entire region.
Okay, so maybe we can quickly run through some of the other countries. I was wondering about Argentina, that seems to have a right-wing joke of a president, but his policies don't seem to be a joke. I mean, he seems to be, practically selling off the country or whatever, in ways that, a left-wing president would not do.
Yeah, I mean, he has been true to his promises, and it just goes to show how, I mean, there was this idea because he was very active on TikTok, and he looked like he was an outsider who was coming to drain the proverbial swamp in Argentina and so on, and he was going to do things like they should be done and so on, and so it drove a lot of people to vote for him under this idea. Well, once he's there, he's not crazy. He's not going to do everything that he says he wants to. But it turns out that he is, and so it has been a disaster in many different aspects, in terms, first of all, I mean, it has deepened the economic crisis, it has worsened inflation, but Milei himself said, this is going to get worse before it gets better. And the difference is that, whereas as before, we talked about this a lot, we had a lot of criticisms for, his predecessor, the Alberto Fernandez government, and how, even though it was dealt a very difficult hand with the pandemic and so on, but it had this heavy weight on its shoulder from this big IMF loan, and was always trying to tread water in terms of how much it was going to go in the direction of really protecting the majority from the economic downturn, and how much it wanted to maintain these international channels open and not run into issues with the IMF and so on. Now with Milei, it's completely different. I mean, he doesn't really care about the majority. He's a libertarian, whatever that term has come to mean these days. And so this has meant, everything you'd expect in a neoliberalism on steroids program, mass layoffs, privatizations, as Babette was mentioning. Just a few days ago, the story was the state airline, the Argentinian state airline, which is one of the biggest here in the hemisphere, and how they are, cutting back on everything, reducing the number of destinations that they have in a bid to make it more attractive for privatization. And so this is, the typical neoliberal discourse of reducing the state and so on. But it has significant long-term consequence, assuming that there will be enough popular outrage to be rid of Milei. I mean, it seems like an eternity away, but whenever the next elections come, then whoever comes is going to find themselves in a much more difficult situation with fewer weapons and tools to address the economy, which is kind of the purpose, right? I mean, make these neoliberal concessions permanent in a way that the countries, and especially countries in the global south, become much more dependent.
Yeah, I mean that's been a pattern before, right? Where you know, someone has a policy and they just lock it in, right? You sell off the state enterprises, you get yourself into these uh, deals where you take out massive loans, you have very, very harsh rules you have to follow to pay it all back. It's all in dollars, right? And it's like you put the country in a bind where it has to follow the path that you've set out for it, and it becomes very, very difficult to do anything else. And it's like you're trying to wriggle out of those chains for like the entire term of your presidency, and it's just I mean, you could do it with like really dramatic, radical action, but that would be very, very difficult politically to get it done. So it's like you're just
Yeah,
stuck.
it's very difficult, and also because of how short these political cycles are. So, it's a 4-year term. So after you get in, and then soon enough, you're going to be campaigning for the legislature, and then you're going to be campaigning again. So there's always a temptation to not, tackle the structural issues. But also, when it comes to making the country more dependent on foreign capital, is also the issue that it comes under the jurisdiction of these state corporate international tribunals that somehow always rule in favor of corporations, that make any effort to regain state presence much more difficult, because then it goes to this litigation, which is itself very expensive, and then they issue this international arbitration award, they have to be appealed and so on, and so it just extends the burden on the state. I mean, here, just quickly on Venezuela, because I mean, eventually we'll come back to Venezuela. But Venezuela found itself in a very promising economic position, and that's why, also, for ideological and a much more ambitious political project. I mean, that's not in question. But that's how Chavez was able to, face off against these corporations and impose much more favorable terms against them. Of course, then, yeah, go ahead.
And as you mentioned, Chavez had a lot of time, right?
Yeah, that's also true, because he had such significant popular support that he knew he didn't have to just think about the next election. He could think about the next 10 years. Some of these nationalizations then came back to bite Venezuela with these international arbitration awards, but that was in a difficult situation because there were sanctions and Venezuela wasn't able to fulfill its obligations. We can actually touch on that if we have 5 minutes and talk about Citgo, but maybe towards the end of the program.
Yeah, no, the ongoing saga that never ends of Citgo is always interesting. It is. There's just so much stuff that happens with that is just so crazy. So I know we want to spend a good chunk of the hour talking about Venezuela. Before we go to Venezuela, anything else we need to pick up? It's 2025, so Cuba just had another anniversary of its revolution. Go Cuba! Yeah.
Yeah, and they got millions and millions of dollars worth of funding from and equipment from China as kind of a anniversary gift, I guess, to help with their energy production for their generators, for things like that, and that made quite a bit of news.
Yeah, and also, Cuba is also always worth celebrating. It's just an incredible example of revolutionary commitment and resistance. So yeah, there was that deal with China, which is significant, and also something I read today that Russia was extending some kind of credit line specifically for the purchase of fuel and other inputs necessary to address this very severe energy crisis that they've had. One thing that I really admire about the Cubans is how forthright they are with the people. They don't just cover up with excuses and don't try to find scapegoats. They say, we are having these issues, we are running out of fuel, so please bear with us. And then they update, we've restored electricity here and there. 60% of the grid is back up and running, and so on. So I mean, they are really up against it because the international context does not help. And because the blockade was tightened under Trump, and then Biden did absolutely nothing to alleviate it. It makes it much harder for them to work in the international trade markets, and also, I mean, they have to purchase these fuel shipments on the spot market. So on a case by case basis, and it's more expensive, and they are also reeling from reduced revenues on the tourism industry. So it's just like a snowball effect that makes it much harder for them to deal with the economy. I mean, their actions, and here I also admire the fact that there's a lot of debate within the party and within the Cuban authorities on what the solution looks like, because I mean they've tried to liberalize and offer more favorable conditions for the tourism industry in the hope that they're going to attract more investment, and that has generated criticism and a bit of resentment that kind of breeds inequality between the people who have access to these dollars and the people who are reliant or still work for the state. And so it's always a balancing act, but what I admire is that there is an overwhelming coherence of the project itself, and the idea that whatever happens, the people need to be at the center of whatever policies put into place.
Right. I mean, there's so much all these things that get decided at local levels. There's like always this dialogue. It's like it is so transparent and democratic. It's like the exact opposite of the image that is portrayed of it as this sort of totalitarian top-down regime.
Yeah.
Everything I've ever seen or heard with Cuba, it's like it's just one popular meeting and one council meeting and one this and one that, one after the other. Like people cannot shut up about what the government can do, and the government cannot just not stop itself from listening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's also a model that's under constant revision and so on. I read, and for people who read Spanish, there's a blog, a website called Latitza, which is from a group of Cuban leftists who may be a bit overly critical of the government sometimes, but it showcases the level of debate that's always going on. And so here, I mean, like you were mentioning, I mean, there's this constant activity at the grassroots level, and I was just praising the government for showing its face and taking responsibility, even when the situation is dire and there are no good news that you can share. But more recently, one of the debates was that local officials have to go out and talk to the people, right? I mean, they cannot just hide behind the overall policies. And so it just goes to show how their process maintains this connection to the grassroots in terms of defending what it stands for.
They will need that connection to the grassroots because Trump, one of his main people advising him will be Marco Rubio, and
Yeah.
he would be the one to want the overthrow of the government there. So I can't imagine what Trump could do more in the way of sanctions or anything, but if there's something more he can do, I'm sure he will.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not necessarily. I mean, in terms of sanctions, I think it's more on the level of enforcement, going after, whoever Cuba is dealing with. And I think this applies to Venezuela as well, jumping a bit ahead of ourselves. But I think it's also, I mean, going back to what we were talking in the beginning about how Democrats are more concerned with appearances, I would expect the Trump administration to turn more of a blind eye to, let's call them crazy people who want to do crazy stuff like,
Right.
Bomb plots in Cuba or try.
I use the word smarter to apply to the Democrats. I have to say, I mean that is a relative term, right?
No, it can be smarter in a very self-interested way.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of just pragmatic and how to go about things, I think both parties have been getting just dumber and dumber and dumber, right? So you're likely not necessarily to see an incoming Democratic administration be that much smarter than the outgoing Republican administration, because everything is just dumbing down year after year.
Yeah, it's a worrying trend.
Yes. There's an upside and a downside. You don't necessarily want your opponent to be stupid if it makes them unpredictable. And particularly not with like nuclear war. But I wanted to say one last thing, which is like we just got news this morning. I mean, we're recording this on January 6th, right? That the BRICS just grew again, right? And so you've got now this entity that has 40% of the world economy and 50% of the world population, and you know it's like you ought to. I mean, I just think they ought to have been doing more all along for Cuba. So it's nice to see Russia coming up with stuff and China coming up with stuff. Um, I mean, it hasn't been their primary concern to go out and like help Cuba, but they don't have the necessarily the same vulnerability that like a French bank has, right?
Mhm.
I mean, if you're Russia, you're already sanctioned anyhow.
Exactly. What's left to sanction? But yeah, I mean, here in this case, I think it's worth, I mean, doing a parallel. There isn't the same kind of internationalist solidarity that we saw in Soviet times when it comes to Cuba, right?
Mhm.
It was much, it wasn't, there wasn't any level of self-interest in these bilateral relations. Now, with Russia and China, there is this multipolar conception, and in that sense, they feel a need to support Cuba, not least because of its proximity to the US. Also, it's worth mentioning that Mexico has been an ally in terms of fuel supplies, and Venezuela remains one of Cuba's main suppliers of crude and fuel, even though those amounts have lowered in recent times, of course, reflecting Venezuela's own situation. So the odds are much harsher for Cuba, but as we were saying, and as you brought up in the beginning, they have shown time and again their resilience and their willingness to find solutions to continue fighting.
Yeah, they managed to put a lot of pragmatism in with their socialism.
Yeah, and of course then there's a matter of balancing those two.
Yes.
So let's bounce over to Venezuela.
Yeah, so
Not very far.
yeah, I can see it from my window. So on Venezuela, let me start on the, let's say, bigger picture, longer term issues, and then we go to what's coming up later this week. So the big question is, what's Trump's policy going to look like for Venezuela? Do we just go by past history, which was this maximum pressure, and the fact that Marco Rubio is in the State Department, and we just conclude that it's going to be, back to the same maximum pressure? Not that Biden deviated that much. I mean, he might have gone to 90% pressure, 95% pressure. So the two questions are, would he revoke Chevron's license to operate here in Venezuela? And that's around, let's say, 25% of the present oil output. I would bet my imaginary farm against that. But then the issue is enforcement. Do they go harder after these intermediaries who are used for Venezuela to be able to sell its crude and so on? So that's, let's say, option A, increasing the sanctions, the economic pressure, and so on to try and provoke regime change in the medium term, perhaps. And then there's option B, which doesn't come from me. It comes from oil lobbyists, also a think tank in Florida International University, and they called it an America First sanctions policy, which entails leveraging the economic pressure to get favorable deals for U.S. corporations, like the one Chevron has right now, and then going after Chinese, Russian, whoever else wants to deal with the Venezuelan oil sector, and then also take advantage in that environment to, on one hand, force migrants back to Venezuela in a way that Trump can find a victory in terms of his deportations. And I mean, I'm quoting from this paper from Florida University, Florida International University think tank. They also say, if we increase the pressure enough, then there's going to be privatizations, and then we can put American corporations in prime position to benefit from those privatizations. So there are two options with many different possibilities and ramifications. They are all bad for Venezuela, but they are quite different in terms of an overall policy direction. And it's not clear. There are signs in both directions. I would think Trump being, having his reality TV show background and having failed so spectacularly with the Guaido experiment, which provided a lot of laughs for us here on the show, he might be reluctant to go down the same route once again. And so,
Guaido provided a lot of laughs for people worldwide.
However, the new the fellow who claims he was elected, even if he wasn't, even if the votes didn't show that, has, even if he's off in Europe, he still is claiming that, he's the president.
Yeah, so that's the big question. And I think one thing comes before the other. First the U.S. government deciding what it wants to do, and then how does the Venezuelan opposition factor into that? So the Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition
Yep.
far right candidate who is claiming victory, is actually very close to you. He was in D.C. today, and he met with Biden in the White House. I mean, they're both so old and frail. It wasn't the most
Yeah.
the most jovial of meetings. And so he's maintaining this claim. But then, both the statement that came from the White House, and he also met with Mike Waltz, who's going to be an advisor on foreign policy for Trump. They both suggested that there isn't anything on the immediate future. So the White House said, this is the person who should be taking office next Friday. Should can mean many different things, but it didn't say this is the person who is going to be taking office, or suggest that there's going to be some kind of parallel inauguration and a parallel government like we saw with Guaido. With Guaido, it was very telegraphed that they were going down this route. And in a meeting with Waltz, the only statement was that they're paying very close attention to Venezuelan developments. So my prediction, and here I've been right on some predictions, I've been wrong on others for sure. I think they're going to maintain this claim, the election wasn't fair, this is the person who won, but without going as far as setting up a whole parallel government with its bureaucracy. And because, that also constrains how much the US can do. It forces them to work with these people who are super annoying. So I think they are going to just keep this claim, and so it's a never-ending excuse to impose economic pressure on the Maduro government.
I'm sure they find the Trump administration super annoying as well.
Yeah, but the Trump administration is the one who makes the decisions in the end, so they just have to fall in line.
So yeah, there's going to be a lot of show about about how this is what should have happened or this is what should have been done, right? But there's not going to be any real force behind trying to put him in or pretend that he is still the guy.
Yeah, I don't think there are any conditions for that. And also, it seems weird that we are looking for positive attributes that Guaido had, but Guaido was younger, and he was in the country, he did believe his fairy tale. So he went out and he spoke like he was the president and gave orders, even though no one was really listening. In this case, this is a kind of a stand-in candidate who didn't really seem like he was up for the job. He's very frail. He doesn't have a lot of energy,
Yeah.
and so I don't see.
But on the bright side, that means no one's going to be throwing chairs at him.
Yeah. Also, he's not in Venezuela, and so I don't see any conditions for him to actually force. He's not someone who go through kind of an illegal border crossing point and appear somewhere in Caracas. And it has been reflected in the main opposition spokesperson, Maria Corina Machado, the poster woman for far right in Venezuela, saying that there's going to be a transition. It might be, so the inauguration is this Friday. It might be on Friday. It might be on Thursday. It might be later. So they are in a way not making it all or nothing, that their guy has to be sworn in and get the presidential sash this Friday. They call protests worldwide, but what matters is what happens here in Venezuelan streets for Thursday, so the day before the inauguration. So this is going to be a bit of a bellwether to see where things are heading, because the most recent protests ever since the election, they just dwindled in attendance very quickly, and so the opposition has struggled to get its people out on the streets. Now, of course, the date is approaching, so it remains to be seen how much they can mobilize on Thursday, and whether that's going to again fall into this street violence and clashes with security forces, to kind of create an atmosphere of instability, because they also want to force the Trump administration's hand, right? See, look at how the Maduro government is repressing democracy and so on, and kind of force more forceful response from the administration.
They can put out slick videos, but it's like they're not. I don't know what. We've talked enough over the years about just how messed up and fragmented the opposition is, how they have a real hard time getting their act together. I think all the problems that you had with Guaido being kind of a buffoon. That wasn't just something that just like came out of nowhere, that they somehow wound up with this buffoon. The there's like very deep problems with the opposition in Venezuela, and it's hard to imagine that there's going to be a lot of like real success on their part in getting something together.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't a buffoon. He was a reflection of their own buffoonish politics. But yeah, I mean, what you say is very accurate because I mean, the rest of the opposition is not really on board with these hardline antics and trying to force things because this is also an electoral year in Venezuela. I mean, we have legislative, municipal, and regional elections coming up, and these other opposition forces kind of want to turn the page and see, let's get our act together and let's inch forward with more spaces in the National Assembly, with more regional governments, more local governments, and so on, as opposed to this tried and repeated and always failed, this all or nothing strategy from some of the main opposition people. So again, it just goes to show that they haven't been able to get on the same page, and I think that's going to continue reflecting in the coming days. That doesn't mean that there isn't, let's say, a sense of danger that there might be instability. I mean, there's also Eric Prince has taken an interest in Venezuela and he was, doing a crowdfunding campaign to gather funds for a military operation in Venezuela, and then that was discontinued amidst corruption allegations that they were just taking Venezuelan fools for their money. But there's also a threat.
I mean, I was already at that conclusion when you said Eric Prince.
Yeah, no real surprise there. But I mean, there's also a danger that someone might try a mercenary operation like we saw in mid-2020 that was immediately snuffed out because, I mean, it was a harebrained project that Guaido had contracted and it didn't really go anywhere. But it might show if there's a climate of instability and hostility that, these people might feel emboldened to try other kinds of more high risk, high reward regime change efforts.
And there is always the fear that there may be an attempted assassination of Maduro.
Yeah, that's also true. Even though the government has become very, very, I mean, the government and the security apparatus has become very cautious and very careful with all sorts of public appearances. Just this day, I went out in Caracas, and you can see that there's a lot of deployment out on the street, which is not necessarily pleasant. I mean, no one is particularly fond of the police, but I mean, it might be just necessary to ensure that there's a minimum of calm. And there's also a lot of international delegates that are coming as witnesses for the inauguration and other activities that the government set up around the inauguration. So my expectation is that there's going to be, I wouldn't say a big opposition protest, but some mobilization. And maybe, I hope I'm wrong, maybe some small episodes of violence, but then that the inauguration is going to take place normally. And there's going to be kind of a longer term strategy in terms of saying, this should have been the president. He's the rightfully elected president. We don't recognize the results. And that is the basis for however the Trump administration is going to approach Venezuela in its second term.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. strategy might be nothing right now other than, long-term plan to have Al-Qaeda take over in 2050.
Actually, I mean, when the Syrian government fell, there was a lot of joy on the Venezuelan opposition in saying, Maduro's next, this is going to happen to the Venezuelan government as well. And I mean, it's not going to happen because the opposition has not been able to develop anything as driven and funded and armed as Al-Qaeda here in Venezuela. So that's the one big difference among many others between Venezuela and Syria.
Right, and then Syria took a long time. Very, 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 very strongly contested, very highly contested for a very, very long time, and a long period of sanctions and a lot of hollowing out of the country. And I know Venezuela has a lot of that issue too, but I don't think it reaches the scale that that Syria had. I mean, you don't have the oil fields like occupied by a foreign army.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, of course, you brought up the long-term effects of sanctions. I think that's something to keep in mind, as something that undermines Venezuelan sovereignty in the long run. And there are, of course, these constant economic challenges. I mean, the government has to ensure that living standards improve. I mean, they have been slowly improving, I would say, but in very unequal terms. And so the government needs to ensure that the situation is working for the majority. Otherwise, it becomes a much more difficult situation to deal with this international siege and also with a lot of discontent on the domestic front. So there's going to be a lot of challenges for sure, regardless of what path the Trump administration chooses.
So, what happened with BRICS? Because that was thought that that would be a way for them to get some economic help or get more trade and such, and then like they were locked out of it.
Yeah,
they didn't get to be members.
Yeah, this was a spate with Brazil over the election, and let's say the Venezuelan government promising that it was going to provide evidence of the final electoral results and then not doing so, and the Brazilians being offended and so on. And so Lula decided to punish, quote unquote, Venezuela by blocking BRICS membership. But even so, I'm on the less optimistic or less immediately optimistic camp concerning BRICS. I think it's positive to create this alternative environment and so on. But when it comes to the things that really matter, creating alternative economic, financial channels and so on, so that the use of sanctions becomes less effective, they still have a long way to go. They haven't been able to set up a bank and nothing like that. And so I don't think Venezuela's status, which wouldn't be a member, it would be this kind of honorary member that they accepted 13 countries. I don't think it would have changed the immediate reality. I think if we ask, what's stopping BRICS countries like China from coming to Venezuela and buying oil directly, that wouldn't change with membership. It's just that sanctions create this environment and they would remain in place regardless of Venezuela entering BRICS. So I think that's something that offers a lot of possibilities in the medium term, but I don't see the tools immediately that would address some of the most pressing issues for Venezuela and similar sanctioned countries.
Right. I mean, and this model of like countries in the global South banding together to form some sort of alternative union among them. I mean, that was presaged by the the regional, like South American, Caribbean entities that Chavez was so instrumental in trying to build up back in that period.
Yeah, I think in that sense, regional integration can actually play a much more significant role in the near term in terms of helping Venezuela navigate this conjuncture. And on that, in Brazil, even though it has its own interests and its own agenda, they have historically been the driving force between some of the more ambitious integration projects. So, I mean, I think that's a more realistic and interesting priority than BRICS, which may have longer, higher potential.
And maybe there's some prospect for, instead of like locking countries into a future where they're have obligations to the World Bank or wherever, that maybe they can lock them into some into regional cooperation in a way that would be harder for the right to pull out of.
Yeah, exactly, and create even if it's just trade mechanisms, ways for countries to deal amongst themselves without being subjected to pressure from the US, and that already offers alleviates the pressure.
Okay. Anything else we want to touch on? Because I know we're getting short on time.
No, I think that basically covers where we're at. So, all eyes on Venezuela. Stay tuned to Venezuela Analysis. We're going to be putting out a lot of content in the coming days. And I'm sure we'll come back to analyze our predictions.
Well, that sounds great. Looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks as always.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.